true exercise here. This is the interactive part of the podcast. If you're listening to this podcast and you know somebody who's lived beyond the age of 90, raise your hand. And if you're driving, honk the horn. I mean, this is real. People are living longer.
What will you do when your money works for you? Welcome to the Tech Girl Financial Podcast with your hosts, Victor and Kim Gaxiola. From the home office in California, here is Victor and Kim.
So one of the benefits of doing podcast recordings is the fact that if you mess up, if you do something wrong, you can stop the recorder, you go back and you re-record it. And so for the experience to the listener, it sounds absolutely seamless. Like there's no mistakes, no issues, no challenges in the recording. But rarely does it ever get to a point where you actually have to re-record the whole podcast because the first time around, it was too tough. So here we are, take two. But why was it so tough?
Wow, I think it's just a really tough topic.
Yeah.
And we're normally used to being so upbeat, but this is scary stuff.
Yeah, I think at the end of the first recording, and so this is the second recording, a couple days apart too. It wasn't like we just said let's go take two and started recording. We actually had to think and digest the information. A lot of the podcast has been this whole idea. I always say it's infotainment. And I was like, well, how can you make this topic entertaining, though? Because it is a deep topic. And so thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to start over. And for you guys, obviously, you didn't notice, you didn't know, and you won't ever listen to that first recording. So here we are, the refined, reviewed, and better recording.
Yeah, and we are going to get a little more serious in this podcast. So if you've listened to us before, just bear with us this time because this is really important information and something that I think helps everyone at all ages.
And I think where the issue really stemmed and why the first recording was so tough, and here we are, was that the more and more we talked about it and the more and more that I internalized it and did research, I realized that a lot of the things that we were sharing, I hadn't done yet. I have yet to do. And that is really to talk about the possibility of dementia or the possibility of Alzheimer's disease happening with, my parents.
Right. And, to be honest, I don't think that I've had that deep of a conversation. And this brings to light that there is a lot of work for us to do for our own family. And we hope as we explore this topic and think about it with our own family, that we will be benefiting all of you listeners out there as well. So really, this is about talking to your parents. We have a lot of clients that are in the sandwich generation and are really busy between being there for their kids and making sure everything is done there, going to work every day, and then seeing our parents start to age a little bit more.
And I think the other thing that really prompted this is, with the holidays approaching, whether it's Thanksgiving or the end of the year celebrations that take place, a lot of that happens with family, especially, parents and a number of generations. And, Tech Girl Financial now for a long time has worked with multiple generations. And so, Kim, I know you've developed a lot of great relationships with families, whether it's the children and then their parents and then their kids or the other way around. But you get to know these people.
Oh my gosh, that's what makes my job so meaningful, is having multiple generations of clients that are families, because we can have these conversations. And when we're all talking together, I think everybody is cared for and looked after in a much more seamless way. So if you're also listening to this podcast and you are someone who may be considered the same age as my parents, listen up. There will be plenty of information as well for you. And so I thank you all for being on this podcast and listening. And the next step is actually doing something.
I think that one of the other catalysts was that we both participated and have been doing some research on the subject and came across a great recording of a webinar that took place with some industry experts that were talking about, some early warning signs and things to consider, because as we've come to find out, it's typically the advisor or people who work with people in their personal finances who will be the first ones to actually understand some of the warning signs and red flags of someone who might be experiencing dementia or the early onset of Alzheimer's.
That's right. And, it doesn't escape me. Every time I'm on a call with my clients, I am making sure to ask them questions and just be mindful of where they are in the aging process. I never thought that this was the business that I was going into, but I am a student of the aging process. And that is one thing that I think makes me a better advisor to my clients.
So some of the takeaways from that actual conversation, Kim, was the idea that, as it relates to how big and prevalent of an issue this is, two reasons why it's become so much bigger of a focus, and that is because of the baby boomer generation. The baby boomer generation, as we know, is one of the largest generations from a demographic perspective who've entered into their 60s in the last decade, are going into their 70s and getting a little bit older. And so some of these diseases, which weren't as prevalent before, are coming more to the forefront because of the large size of the demographic baby boomer generation. But in addition to that, it's the fact that people are living longer. And so these diseases may not have actually started because people were dying of heart disease and cancer and other diseases that are now being treated through medical science.
Yeah, that's right. And these baby boomers, there's a lot to say about them. And as I say that in an endearing way because my parents
in a loving way.
Are baby boomers.
We love the boomers.
Yes, we do, because they're our parents. But I also say that because they are free spirits and they want to do it their way. And it's, they're always healthy and young and, fun-loving people. But I think that as we see that, it may be one of our challenges with that, with the baby boomers as well, because they may tend to fight going into a home or having more care and thinking they are more capable of taking care of themselves as they start entering in those phases. Mm-hmm. And that's what scares me. It's the uncertainty, right?
Well, yeah, that's exactly what it is, Kim. As you said, the uncertainty that comes with what is this disease? How does it, what's the onset of it? How can you fully know if someone's suffering from it? I mean, other diseases, and not to make light of them, but when you look at cancer or heart disease, there are a lot of warning signs, but there are also medical ways to be able to ensure or to know that that is the actual ailment. And then there are, years and decades worth of research and information as it relates to how to address those particular diseases. There are treatments for those diseases. I think it's the uncertainty of dementia and sometimes the challenge of being able to identify and diagnose it, which makes it really difficult. And so this is why it's important to have this conversation. And I think that there's two approaches that you can take to this conversation. The first one, which I'd love for you to expand on, is the types of questions and the types of conversations you should be having with your loved ones when they still are within a mental capacity of having those conversations.
Yeah, and before we bring that up, I was just looking for a very scary statistic because I had heard it and I couldn't remember. Usually I remember all these scary stats, but this one I couldn't remember it, and it's probably because I wanted to forget it.
You
and
forget
that
the numbers
is,
you don't like, yeah.
Yeah, and that was that almost 2/3 of Americans with Alzheimer's are women.
Yes, yeah. Some other statistics. You want me to scare you some more?
Yeah.
Currently, 5.8 million people have Alzheimer's, according to the Alzheimer's Association. However, that number is expected to grow over the course of the next couple of decades up to 14 million. So there again, going back to the fact that the demographic is so large and people are living longer. And 1 in 3 seniors dies from Alzheimer's, which is more than people with breast cancer and prostate cancer combined. Those were the stats that I looked into, and it were just scaring me.
Yeah, they are pretty scary, and it doesn't also have to be Alzheimer's, but I think that everyone, as they age and they get to a certain level, has some form of dementia happening to them, mm-hmm. and a lot of times it's medications or just aging that your brain it kind of wears out before your body.
Yeah. And it goes back to, like I said, it's the uncertainty of knowing whether or not it is a more serious problem, or is it just what they say, a senior moment, right? Is it just a blip? It's like, oh, I forgot the address, or I went to the wrong place, or I ordered the wrong thing. Is it just a mistake? Because I have those senior, I'm using air quotes, those senior moments myself, and I just turned 50, right? I don't think it's dementia, certainly not, Alzheimer's, at least I'd like to think it isn't. But those are the things, is sometimes it's hard to know. Right.
Yeah, definitely. And so we'll talk about that because there is some gray area, but this is something that you're not going to find out in a day or anything, right? Mm-hmm. From one action. It's just being more mindful and present with your parents so that as you start seeing more things and it happens on a frequent basis, then you'll know what to do. So
we're not necessarily recommending that if you're sitting around having Thanksgiving dinner, or you're sitting around having a holiday meal, you've got the turkey and all the fixings and all the good stuff that you typically do, that you're going to go deep into a conversation about dementia. But there are some approaches when it comes to wanting to have that conversation with a few questions you can ask your loved ones.
Yeah, and naturally, the sooner you prepare for this, the better off you're going to be, because in a perfect world, you will make all of your arrangements while your parents still have full mental capacity. Mm-hmm. Because once they have lost that, it's extremely difficult to get guardianship, and it takes a long time. And so there could be a lot of suffering in the meantime for your loved one to have the right care. Mm-hmm. And so it's really important. Get to this sooner. So the conversations that you really should be having now are going to be about financial planning, really. Mm-hmm. This is something that you should be planning for, just like you plan for your retirement, just like you plan for your kids' college education. So the questions that you should start off with is, identifying the objectives of your parents, or if you are my parents' age, identify your objectives, right? What do you want to have happen if things don't go according to your plan?
So that's the first question, right?
Right. Yeah. What if you need care beyond what you might anticipate happening?
And then just leave it open, right? To have that conversation. And they may not be prepared to have that answer right away. Mm-hmm. It may take some time to think about it. The good news here is that you're at least prompting that conversation.
Right. This isn't something you have to answer today, but just take some time and think about it. And I would say the second part of that conversation is, who do you trust to fulfill these wishes and needs?
Who in the family, or perhaps outside of the family, do you feel confident will be able to carry through those wishes or to make the tough decisions?
Right. And I know in a lot of families, maybe one person is better at caretaking, while another family member may be better at the finances. And that's a really good way to share in the caretaking responsibilities as well.
And I'll use this as an opportunity to share. In the first season of our podcast, we did, in the Breaking Money Silence, also talk about, in one of the episodes, how you go about talking to aging parents about any other conversations. And we know that it's not going to be easy, especially if it's not something that you're used to having a conversation. But the important thing is, and this is one of the outcomes of the Breaking Money Silence, is that we find that oftentimes the parents or the people that you care for, they want to have the conversation. And it's really, sometimes it takes, what's going to be the catalyst to start that conversation, that discussion.
Right. So if you're just asking the questions, now is the time to ask, but don't expect everyone to have all the answers at this point in time. Just allow them time to get back to you and time to think about those questions. And then maybe after the holidays, when things slow down and are not so busy, then embrace the question again, but this time to find out what their thoughts were as you had originally just planted a seed, and maybe that seed took time to grow. And, the most important thing is, once they have those wishes and they're starting to feel more comfortable with their wishes, is to seek help from an attorney and get the proper documents in place. Nowadays, it's usually a package deal where, you get a will, a trust, a healthcare power of attorney for your finances and your healthcare wishes, directives. All of that is a package deal typically, because they're all super important documents that you need to have.
And those are conversations that me, as the advisor, as a financial planner, would be more than happy to have and work with the CPA and work with the estate planning attorney just to ensure that everybody's interests are being met.
Right. And for those who are in a great situation, maybe your parents have already put that in place, which is great. But how often have they gone back and looked at them to make sure that they're still relevant given what has changed in their family? You could have made those plans 5, 10, 15 years ago, and maybe they're not the same plans anymore. What if, you could have had a family member pass away that was intended to be an executor, or just a lot of different circumstances happen and change. And so you want to revisit them maybe every couple of years.
That's right. So we're encouraging you to have these conversations while, all full mental capacities are at their top, they're at their best place to be. But there are other things to consider as well, right, Kim?
Yeah, there are. And there are lots of tools out there to financially help aging parents. And you may think, they're in their 60s. What can you do now? We didn't plan for that ahead of time. That was in the olden days. That thought was more relevant when long-term care was issued in a different way. So there are plenty of tools out there still, but it's important that you address them earlier.
Yeah.
And the earlier you do it, the more tools that are going to be available to you. But certainly there are still things that you can do in your 60s and early 70s. I would say as long as you have full mental capacity, there are things that can be done. And they're by far a lot easier while you have no intentions of going anywhere than when the time is imminent.
Mm-hmm. Well, the truth is people are living a lot longer. You and I do participate in a number of industry events and conferences, and almost when they have the question or they ask the question of any crowd that we've been at, and when you sit in these and they say, how many of you, by raising your hands, know someone who's lived to 90, and almost all the hands go up, and how many of you know someone who's lived beyond 100, and maybe not as many hands, but the hands still come up. So true exercise here. This is the interactive part of the podcast. If you're listening to this podcast and you know somebody who's lived beyond the age of 90, raise your hand. And if you're driving, honk the horn. I mean, this is real. People are living longer.
Yeah. And so I just go back to the whole idea. These are hard questions to ask. So another way of phrasing this that I like is just to tell your parents, because I know I'm not expecting it to happen to my parents, but, I don't anticipate this is going to happen to you, Mom. But if it does, what would you like to have happen?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We should have a plan.
We should have a plan. Now, Kim, what are some of the warning signs, or let's say red flags that one would be on the lookout for that may hint to the fact that there could be a problem?
Okay, so I mentioned that I am in the aging business.
And, good,
this is one of the reasons why I say I'm in the aging business, is really to be able to see things and recognize signals that trigger the need to have a conversation with the client and perhaps their family members. So one thing that I will say FINRA has done recently is to have a trusted contact on all new accounts that we open up. So we have the ability to put a trusted contact in there. It doesn't mean that we can make trades with that person or give a lot of information, but at least we have somebody there that if we need to speak out to that person, if we see certain things changing and patterns that are not normal, that we can reach out to that person. So I thank FINRA for that change in the paperwork because that will help all of us. So if you have a parent that you are not aware of their accounts or whatnot, ask them about this. This may be an opportunity for you to get involved, is to understand that there is this option available to you. So one of the reasons why we are the first to notice signs of losing mental capacity is because it is typically those math skills that are lost first or start to be a lot harder for seniors to take on. So if you go to your parents' house and you see a lot of bills piling up, it could be because they no longer can figure out how to write a check, how to balance their checkbook, or just pay those bills. And, they're going to deny it. They're going to put it off. And so when you see that, that could be a situation that you need to look out for. Certainly when it comes to having conversations with me, I can see, things that were easy for them to understand, they're asking a couple more questions about, or they could consistently ask about the same thing, time and time again when I talk to them. So, this is not something that I can figure out in a one-call situation, but over time, if I see someone asking me the same questions over and over, not seeming to understand things that they could understand very easily a few years back, then I'm like, doot. My red flag goes up. So think about that. Are there simple things that you're having to explain over and over again?
Yeah, I think it's actually pretty common for them to be unaware, that they actually may be having an issue. And that's part of what makes this so scary is, is this, like I said, a blip, or is this the signs of a much deeper issue that we need to address?
Yeah. And here is this really scary thing is that sometimes they do know that they're losing mental capacity and they get really good at disguising that something is wrong because they want to keep their independence. They want to be independent for as long as possible, right? And it's scary. And denial, shoot, we all deny things that we don't want to think are happening. Put it off. And so that is a sign. That is something that people have a tendency of doing as well with Alzheimer's. And so, and the second thing is you could be in denial as a child. I mean, here are our parents. They took care of us. They raised us. We look up to them for their wisdom. And now all of a sudden we're going to have to take over as caretaker. That's not something we want to do. We want them to be our parents and our caretakers forever, right? And so it could be that family members are also in denial.
I think that's probably, full circle coming back to what prompted us to have to re-record this was just that realization that a lot of this is talking about control. And, it would be very disheartening to see someone that you've loved who's always been, on top of their game and in control all of a sudden start showing signs that they're not anymore and that they need, a helping hand.
Yeah, we have a member in our family that is getting up there in age and I suspect has signs of losing mental capacity, and it's possible it could be dementia. And she's gotten very suspicious and argumentative with family members who are taking care of her. And so, that's another thing that happens is the suspicion. And I've seen this first experience with clients. They get really suspicious. One minute, they're very trusting with their child who's going to take care of their finances for them. And the next minute, they don't want them to have anything to do with it. And that's a red flag when they keep flip-flopping back and forth, whether they want their child to help them with things or not. So think about that. Think about suspicion, anger, too. This can be aggravating to the senior and they can get very angry. And if it's a constant anger when they normally weren't that angry, then that's something to look out for and maybe pay more attention to, all of these warning signs as well. Here's another one that strikes close to home is because my dad is hard of hearing. And so, how do I know if it's just hard of hearing or, again, a mental problem? So that's one thing that we need to keep track of also is, it could be not that they have any problems with dementia or mental capacity. It could be a hearing problem. And so you have to explore all the issues before you assume it's one or another. So I would say, think about that and make sure that that's part of the conversation. A great question to ask your parents if you're seeing behavioral changes and noticing things and you just want to flat out ask them some questions, because it is really important to have a conversation directly with them. I like this one, and that is, I noticed something different with you. What's going on? Because it could be that they changed medicines.
Right.
And that could have a change with their system, with their, forgetting things more often. When you change medications, there are a lot of side effects. And so it could be a side effect from a change of medication. So find out, ask directly. I noticed something is different with you. What's going on? Another thing that I'm mindful is are my clients meeting me when we're supposed to meet? So if they all of a sudden call up with a delayed appointment or they can't make it and they give me a reason why, that could be a sign that something is up as well. Maybe they couldn't find their keys and they're too afraid to say that, or they lost your address, or there can be a lot of reasons why that's happening. But remember, what you're trying to detect is a change in behavior. And so if this is somebody who is always on time to appointments and now all of a sudden they're changing things, that could be something to watch out for. And while we're on the topic of change is, looking at beneficiary changes. I just thinking of that too is, are they changing their beneficiary often? Perhaps that may even be a whole bigger issue of senior abuse. And so that's something to be mindful of as well is, maybe they forgot that they had already changed the beneficiary, or maybe somebody's pressuring them to change their beneficiary. And so we have to be mindful. A lot of changes, that's something to look at. And fortunately, nowadays, we do have technology, and financial institutions are getting better and better with artificial intelligence. So just like, we get a call pretty quickly when somebody has used our credit card and the bank suspects fraud. This is happening in the financial world where, if they notice something different, like a Social Security check was deposited and that money comes out immediately when normally it didn't, well, that might be a red flag for this artificial intelligence to look at things. And, this is where it's going. It's not completely there, but things are changing, which will be helpful for all of us taking care of our family members.
Yeah, it horrifies me that there really are people out there that really will take advantage of the situation and take advantage of seniors who are suffering from certain ailments. And, there's the grandchild scam. There's all kinds of scams. And, you don't have to dig too deep to see, how they can be taken advantage of.
Yeah. And one thing I tell my clients, because the question comes up, how do I make sure that nothing is happening to my parents when it comes to their finances and they're not being scammed, is we do have software where you can review what their expenses are. We can set it up to see credit card expenses, your checking accounts, all of that. So you can supervise it, on a weekly, monthly basis, however active you want to be a part of it. But there is software. And as long as we have the parents' approval to be able to share that with our clients, then that helps them take care of those finances, even if they're not in the same location, right? Because, we're all spread apart across the country as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that also speaks to the reasons why it's a good idea to consider that consolidation of assets and the diversification I think you spoke about before.
Right. I know so many people think, and I think the older generation really thought this, that you are diversified if you have, different bank accounts and different brokerage accounts. And really that makes your life so much more complicated, especially as you're losing the capacity for math and financial things. It's a good idea to consolidate it. And, aside from the FDIC quota for, the money that's going to be in cash at a bank, when you have investments, it doesn't matter where those investments are. If you have, 500,000 in stock at Charles Schwab and 500,000 in stock at Fidelity, you're not diversified because you have it at Schwab and Fidelity. You're diversified because you have multiple stocks in your portfolio. Mm-hmm. And so bring it all in one place, make it easier.
So bringing this whole subject, full circle, we know people will be gathering over the holiday period, and you don't have to wait just for the holidays to have these conversations. These can be ongoing, whether it's Easter or summer or Labor Day or President's Day. The important thing is that you start having the conversation. We thought we'd provide, some tools and things and the types of questions you can ask to at least get the conversation started. And to remember that you're not alone in having these conversations.
You are not alone. And if you are finding it really hard to engage in the conversation or don't know what's the right question to open this up with your family, talk to me. I have done this with a lot of clients when they're afraid to bring up this topic with their parents. And after I know a little bit more about the situation, I'm able to give them some good questions and give them some pointers on how to embrace the subject. And if that is too hard in its own, is just having those one-on-one conversations, invite them in to see me. And have that conversation, with me or your parents' advisors, but get together in a room with their trusted advisors so that you can have that conversation. And sometimes bringing in a third party makes it a little less emotional. And so that's a helpful thing for you to do as well. But remember, this doesn't have to be done all at once, and we do engage in those conversations.
And someone else who usually is involved in these conversations, and it's important to remember, is the estate planning attorney or the other financial professionals that are going to help with actually crafting the specific documentation, whether it's a will, a trust, a healthcare directive. So the good news, Kim, as you know, is that in our next podcast, we're going to have Barbara Pretlove of Pretlove Law, who's going to join us to talk a little bit more about the specifics when it comes to establishing the right kinds of documentation to ensure that your wishes are carried out.
There are some interesting things that you can read out there, and I'd like to share those with you. So we will leave some links in the show notes. So do take a look at those. And if you want to get more detail about these topics, and also just stories that will allow you to see the situation from real life experience, I think go to the show notes and follow the links.
Well, Kim, I think that this podcast recording was better than the first one. And we're going to keep this one because I don't think we want to record it for the third time. But I will say this. I'm really glad that we're addressing it. And we hope that, this has been something informative for those of you who are listening to have those tough conversations. And we recognize it's not an easy conversation to have, and I'm prepared to do it myself.
Right. And if it is that hard, make sure you reward yourself after.
I will. I will reward myself. I will definitely reward myself. So once again, this is the Tech Girl Financial Podcast with my co-host,
Kim Gaxiola.
And we want to remind everybody, what will you do
when your money works for you?
We'll see you next time.
If you have questions, comments, or suggestions for future shows, please send an email to victor@techgirlfinancial.com or join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag AskTGF. We also encourage you to follow us on the Tech Girl Financial page on Facebook and connect with us on LinkedIn.
Securities offered through registered representatives of Cambridge Investment Research, Inc., a broker-dealer member FINRA SIPC. Investment advisory services offered through Cambridge Investment Research Advisors, a registered investment advisor. Tech Girl Financial and Cambridge Investment Research, Inc. are not affiliated companies.